And let's kick things off with some intros. My name is Melissa. I work here at Prevalent in business development. And today we have a returning guest. We have Dave Shackleford, CEO at Voodoo Security and SANS Senior Instructor. Welcome back, Dave. And last but not least, we have Scott Lang. Scott's our VP of Product Marketing here, and he'll dive into how we may be able to help mature your TPRM program at the end of this session. So hello, Scott.
Hello, Melissa.
As a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded, so you will get this along with the slideshow just shortly after that webinar ends. Lastly, you're all muted, so just use that Q&A box for those questions and feel free to ask the questions anonymously if that works for you best. And without further ado, Dave will share the critical steps you need to take in the first 24 hours of a security incident so we can prepare your incident response plan best. So go ahead, Dave.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for having me back. And thanks everybody for joining us here today. Look, this is one of those topics. And look, I also love time sensitive titles, right? So, what do you do in the first 14 minutes, kind of thing. But the truth of the matter is I've seen a lot of clients and organizations I've worked with scramble a bit in some of these scenarios, particularly those that have unfolded over the past several years that have gotten, sadly, progressively worse. And so there's a whole lot of interesting factors that sort of tie in to third-party breach scenarios versus sort of the classic in-house, breach scenarios. And the thing is, there's sort of this juxtaposition that's occurring between the two, especially with the types of service organizations and different software vendors and managed service providers that more and more organizations are increasingly using. And so here, ultimately we're getting close to the end of the year here in 2023, and there have been some unbelievably crazy third-party scenarios that have unfolded. Now, what's funny is I've actually done talks on third-party risk management and some of the breach scenarios for several years running, and I feel like it's a Groundhog Day situation because I get to the end of the year and I look back and go, wow, it's really been a bad year. But it's been a bad year for several years because there's just a litany of reasons, truthfully. But I'd say one of those is, organizations that are getting targeted more frequently are, in fact, very often those that provide significant types of, many cases, technology services and offerings to other organizations, meaning the attackers are kind of moving up the supply chain significantly more than they used to. It makes sense. If I'm an attacker and I can go target somebody like a SolarWinds or a Kaseya, or some of the others that we've seen even this year. I mean, Microsoft had a real fun situation that turns out to have been going on for several years. There was this little software package called MOVEit that some of you might be aware of that just was the gift that kept on giving. The list goes on and on. I mean, we could probably spend the next 30 minutes talking about just some of the more interesting scenarios we've seen this year. We won't, because you can read the news just like I can. And I'm quite sure that some of you have not only been, sort of just keeping track of it, but you've probably also, sadly seen some of this, like right up close and personal. I hope that's not the case for you, but my strong guess is at least some of you that's probably true. So sorry about that. So what, just to sort of, just introduce this, set the stage a bit, what we're seeing is that we're having to adapt. Things are moving up the supply chain. We've got lots of software-based scenarios that are unfolding, lots more vendors on the docket, lots more partners. We've got business units. Again, so many factors. So just by way of example, I work with lots of clients that grow, sort of naturally and organically very often by way of mergers and acquisitions. And I'm sure that some of you probably fall into that camp as well. And what happens, of course, is that when you merge or you acquire, you sort of inherit things. And sometimes those are mission critical things, sometimes they're not. But invariably, you inherit things, and sometimes those things bring some baggage. Or you might not even know you have those things. And we'll talk about some of these challenges a little later on in this discussion. But there's just lots of ways that we've got to adapt. If you've sort of looked inward in your organization and you feel like you've got a grasp on the third parties that you use, the software that's in use, And I hope you do, by the way. I hope this is something that you feel pretty comfortable with because it does play a big role in breach mitigation and certainly just third-party risk management. But I would say when you sort of acquire or merge, you may not even know those things. And we've seen a lot of that, right? We've seen lots of cases where those kinds of things occurred. So lots of technologies, lots of partners. You get it. I get it. We get it. But these are definitely factors that can play in. So, I mean, looking down the common incident types that we've seen, I mean, I could probably just say everything right here, and that would probably suffice for everybody, just because, as I said, you're probably out there living it too. But we've definitely seen some failure scenarios, just things that failed, things that broke. So, may or may not have been a directed attack, but it's risk. We're just talking risk. And I would call a failure a significant outage that impacts you both monetarily and operationally. That's a major risk that you've got to take into account. Availability and redundancy is a factor too. You've got insider attacks. We've seen a few of those as well. We've also seen cases where data was leaked. We found malware infections. I mean, the gift that keeps on giving, of course, ransomware. You've got unauthorized use scenarios. We've got all sorts of denial of service that are happening. Lots of things that sort of tend to play out. As I said, we could probably just say, everything is an apt way to describe this. But for any of you that do incident response, or you're responsible for managing security operations teams and functions and process workflows, you have to accordingly take into account the types of attacks that are occurring and the types of scenarios that are unfolding when you look at your response plan. It gets a little different when it's a vendor, right? When it's a third party. And we'll get to that here in just a moment, because I think there's a very big difference between, hey, my vendor is experiencing an outage, right? They're just unavailable for some period of time, versus, hey, I've got data theft, right? I've got data exposure. I've got something that is potentially going wrong, that I've got to take into account. And it might be in my house. It might be not quite in my house yet, but I got to look at things a bit differently in that regard. And again, that's going to rely on your knowledge of the vendor, how they're connected, what your sort of interrelationship and interactions look like. And so knowing this, right, knowing is half the battle. I really believe that in this case, because there's this big, classic consultant, common statement. It depends. It kind of does, right? It kind of does depend. So I'll necessarily genericize, at least conceptually, some of the big things that you're going to want to do when breaches occur, but then I'll give some extrapolated comments around, what to do in this case, what to do in that case. Those kinds of things I think matter too. Right. Again, we're not necessarily good at this either. I mean, and I'm not speaking for everybody here. Believe me, I'm not trying to paint with too broad of a brush, but overall, I tend to find that we're getting better at this. But especially as a big organization, I mean, the bigger you are and the more vendors and third parties that you work with, the higher the risk profile. I mean, I sort of look at third parties with, again, the sort of asterisk of depends on how you're working with them, as just representation of threat surface in a lot of ways. If you're sharing data or if you're using services, anytime you've got those interrelationships, then sure, they could have an impact that ultimately trickles down to you. So thus, it's a bigger risk profile and a bigger threat surface. But at the same time, if you've got hundreds or thousands of them, there's a real good chance you haven't broken it down with regards to all their security capabilities, up-to-date security controls and policies and processes, updates and changes that have occurred there, what their uptime, what their availability looks like, and what it needs to look like with regard to sort of day-to-day business use cases, and on and on and on. And one of the things I've done in the past couple of years, as just a tangent, I've done a lot of work with clients around business continuity and doing things like business impact analysis. And you can probably guess one of the primary drivers for this is ransomware. Everybody's freaking out about ransomware. Makes sense. I mean, again, it's a big problem, but it's driving just sort of that inward look at like operational continuity. Do we have processes? Do we know what we're going to do if things break? And when it comes to third parties, I always ask what I would sort of put out as table stakes questions right there on the table to say, hey, do you have a broken down, prioritized list of critical third parties that you have specific metrics and associated, sort of numbers around. In other words, how long can they be down? What's the impact if they are? What do you do about that? Do you have a backup? I mean, you could probably guess all those sort of table stakes questions. And it's really shocking to me how many organizations don't really have this in as complete a format as they probably need to. I mean, I'm talking like tier one stuff. It goes down, you got problems. People can't get their jobs done. And I would even give, just as an example, I mean, look at somebody like Microsoft. For any of you that are out there using Microsoft 365 services, and some of you are probably going, yep, what happens if they go down? I mean, I'm just talking like unavailable, not even remotely available. And so the natural inclination, you're thinking like, okay, it's email, maybe. Yeah, of course. But it's also things like SharePoint. It's also a number of other, services and things that might, trickle down into things like some of the Microsoft Defender services in the cloud, even things like multi-factor authentication. And the other factor here too is the response plans. The number of people that say, well, what's your internal communication strategy during an incident? The number of people say, yeah, we're using Teams. I'm like, no, you're not. Teams is down too. What's the workaround, right? What's the backup? And it simply illustrates that if you don't have those backups and you don't have some other means to sort of take care of business in the interim, then sure, you're going to have maybe a larger impact than you had realized. Again, you know this, I know this. It's just an example. So let's talk about it, right? Let's talk about some of these major breaches and some of these big dependencies and even some of the connectivity challenges and so on that we've got. It's this, I'll call it a new risk category, but it's sort of not a new risk category. I think it's a heightened risk category that you sort of bring into the mix because we're much more dependent on most of these types of providers, maybe than we have been in the past. And it's only getting more so. And so I don't tend to see, sort of people turtling up and internalizing more services. Quite the opposite. More people are using managed services. They're using cloud services. There's this sort of semi-fanatical CIO, cliche of let's get out of the data center. And so you're distributing your organization's infrastructure. So, and while that looks good, maybe from a CapEx, OpEx perspective, it also brings new risks. I'm gonna do some real time, Q&A and chat action here as we're going along. I just saw Angela's comments show up here. The challenge is being able to categorize the real critical services, because every business owner seems to think their service is critical. Sure, in a large and complex organization, this can be a real challenge. Oh, you're not wrong at all. I couldn't agree more, in fact. What's fun is when you flip it back to them and say, okay, yours is critical. You're now responsible for telling us everything we need to know about recovery practices, uptime, all the metrics, and everything else. And nobody loves that. The sad truth, and look, we could probably go down a dark, terrible rabbit hole that Angela just so aptly brought us to. But it sounds great if you have a bunch of risk and security professionals together like this, where we can look at one another and go, yeah, flip it back to them. But the sad truth of the matter is that very often, and maybe it's political, maybe it's just a lack of knowledge. They think it's IT's job to do this. Well, I'm just the business owner. I'm just the app owner. My job is business function X or running site Y, or this geographic location or what have you. Versus, I really need to know the sort of nuts and bolts and the ins and outs of what it's going to take, not only to operate these functions and services, but to make sure that they're up and running in an appropriate fashion in the case of an outage or a disaster or a breach. And so, yeah, again, it all sounds good here amongst friends. Those things change necessarily when you get back into meeting conversations on on premises and such. So yeah, great point. I love commentary like that as we get into this. Because it really just illustrates the headaches, right? Yeah, okay. Yeah, it looks like we maybe had something, and that's a great comment. Thank you, Jess. Yeah, that comment came in to the hosts and the panelists. versus the entire audience. So yeah, just like I said, I actually just read pretty much verbatim Angela's comment, and a couple other folks chimed in and said, "Yep, it's happened to me as well." Right. So yep, and Melissa just put that out to everyone. So thank you for pointing that out. I usually tend to read these things fairly verbatim anyway, but maybe with a little paraphrasing. But thank you for. I didn't realize that that was only to a select group. So okay, here we go. Moving along, and seeing some of these other things come in. So let me jump into sort of the crux of this. I see a couple questions that are coming in. Absolutely going to make sure that I get to those here, and that we make sure we address those things. But let's talk about some of these sort of things that you need to be thinking about. And even though this feels like a Captain Obvious moment. I mean, I say that very tongue in cheek because I would strongly guess that most of you feel that way too. But we talk about contacts of those third parties, and it is astonishing to me how often they're out of date and you don't really know who to reach out to, because we're talking third party breach scenarios, whether they're somebody that's connected to you or have some presence within your infrastructure, or whether it's a wholly externalized third party. Either way, you still need to reach out and find out what the heck is going on. And it's surprising to me that many organizations just don't have those contacts ready to go. And like I said, I hate pointing fingers because everybody's busy and there's too much going on. But wow, this needs to be done for critical services and third parties. And I would break this down. And this is me shooting from the hip, just based on working with lots of clients. And honestly, just having conversations with folks just like you and maybe my SANS students and others. But I'd say number one, anybody that has access to and or possession of certain critical data types, particularly that's regulated or falls under the umbrella of compliance, you need their contact info, period, because you need to find out quickly what's really going on to the best degree possible, because you may have requirements down the line. I mean, if it's sensitive data for your customers or something that's related to say your own partners or someone else, you need to know this, and you need to know it really fast. So you need to have those contacts and make sure that those are lined up, because I would be reaching out the minute I had an inkling something was wrong. And sadly, we often find out that something's wrong through other third-party sources. It's in the media or something else. Whatever the incident sort of input is, then you need to find out from those contacts what they can tell you. Sometimes they can't, particularly if there's law enforcement involved or if it's part of a larger scale campaign. They may not be able to disclose a lot of details, and that's not that surprising. And I always tell people, hey, look, don't. It's very easy to get, I almost want to say up in arms, and maybe even almost a little aggressive about the fact you feel like you're owed that information. I understand this. I've been in the seat of full-time responder, and I've actually been in those scenarios myself where hey, what you're potentially causing me pain. I need to know everything that I need to know. And so it's like, okay, yeah, but again, there may be circumstances that you're not aware of. So see what they can tell you, try to stay calm. More than anything else, it's your exposure and any data access. And if your data is accessed, there is to some degree an obligation on their part to reveal that, especially under most contracts and most compliance regulatory needs today. Especially if it's personal data or other sensitive data that's very highly governed by regulatory industries. So I'd say that's the big things. Obviously, if there's next steps, and look, if we're talking about like a software vendor with like an ODay, yeah, I want to know next steps, right? Is there something you recommend I do based on what you've seen and what the circumstances sort of warrant? I would certainly be fishing for a bit of that, and any recovery plans. And recovery plans are probably most apt in an outage, right? So, I mean, look, if vendor X is down, I need to know what I can find out so that I can provide communications to my other stakeholders. And certainly the SLAs or potential contractual obligations that you have or don't tie into this too, those are going to be subjective. So that's going to come back to sort of whatever else you may have in the contracts realm or in your vendor management realm. But the sort of generic version of this is, get as much as you can. I'd say number two, potentially isolate. This is very much going to depend on what kind of breach you're talking about. And increasingly, we've seen a bunch of cases where it's something that's tied to you. It's a connection. It's assets, systems, services, potential user accounts, and things that might be in place. And in those cases, if basically they've had a problem and it's come into your house through some channel, or you suspect that it may, so you don't even know all the details yet. I would say you suspect that it may at this point, then you need to find out how you can perform some types of restrictions. And so lock accounts. Not necessarily removing them, but lock them so that they can't be used or updated or manipulated in some way. Restricting privileges, always a good idea. I mean, that's a good idea long before you ever get to a breach scenario. But if you've got a service account that's in use with a vendor, then you should have some sense of, hey, this is where they are and this is what privileges they have and to what. I mean, a great example of that is SolarWinds, right? I mean, that's the gift that keeps on giving in third-party risk management, because that was a horrifying case where you realized they have access to just an enormous amount, highly privileged piece of software that can go everywhere by design. And trying to restrict the privileges of that was really tough. And so, this is actually something to go back and do ideally ahead of time too. Doing some network and local host based restrictions and access controls. The best you can do is the best you can do. But what I always roll back to in this case is, look, if you're trying to figure this out when it happens, you're probably going to fail. Just being dead honest here. Have a playbook, right? Have a playbook for isolation methods, and ideally even have a playbook that's specific to certain vendors, certain service providers, and certain software that if you got to break the glass, you got a playbook to do it, right? You can do it. You know who to notify. Hey, we're locking this down. We don't want it to spread or become a bigger problem than it probably is, or we suspect it might be. The more of that you have done ahead of time, the better off you're going to be. So preparation is always a big factor. Remediation ultimately depends on the type of breach, big time, because if you're talking about something entirely within the third party environment, you really can't do this. Ultimately, this is not something that you can do anything about. They got to fix this problem. And so if it is internal, if it is a piece of software, and I'm talking about software based scenarios in the sort of third party and supply chain models all the time these days, because it is increasingly a bigger part of the problem than ever before, then I need to know if I can fix it. Do you have a workaround? When do you expect a patch? And fun and fun and fun and fun. But if it's something that's just their side of it, what you really need to find out is, on my side, what do I need to do proactively to try to get ahead of this problem? My sense of remediation is almost more of a containment strategy. For those of you that are familiar with the NIST, kind of classic, multi-staged model for incident response, which is 800-61 for those of you that care. But the classic phases of that, it's a big one. You got short-term containment, you've got longer-term containment, but I think containment and coordinated breach response, which often comes down to compliance, comes down to communications, comes down to to some degree the scope. So if it's limited to one data type that's sensitive, but it's predominantly internal only, so it's intellectual property or something, that's one case scenario. But if you're doing business through a third party breach, you got some big time scrambling to do with regards to communications. And that's going to likely tie into privacy regulations and some other factors too. So there's going to be a bunch of coordination that needs to be done. And that's, in a lot of those scenarios, that's about all you can do. You can't really do much more than that, because you're in a position where you're waiting on them, right? It's the third party that has had the problem in the first place. So build out these playbooks, but build out these plans, as best you can. And I would say, obviously, each type of software is sort of its own, special unicorn. So it's going to be dependent on that vendor. So in the case of, of the company that had MOVEit, I mean, they had really explicit things to do. We've seen some, really interesting and fairly significant vulnerabilities that have been released. A good one that comes to mind very recently that's still actually they're seeing some problems still unfold is Confluence. And some of you probably use Confluence. I'm betting. That's a good gamble on my part. And they've got a bunch of good information on their site. It's indicators to look for. It's versions that you really want to check for. And in some cases, it's patches. Update to this version if you can, et cetera, et cetera. The best you can do is the best you can do. Nobody loves emergency upgrades, me included. But if it's warranted and it's going to ultimately prevent major breach scenarios from unfolding and becoming worse, then might be worth looking at. So again, you get the idea. Anytime you can remediate, great, but have some pre-built plans for initiating things like the communications. And we're talking the concept here is the first 24 hours after breach or after you're notified that a breach has happened. And that may mean it may have happened before that 24 hours. You know this. But have those plans, because the second depending on the type of data and what it represents, there are very particular stakeholders within your organization that need to be notified. And those communication chains are really important. Just had another comment come in from Vincent and says, hey, look, stay in constant communication with the third party. In fact, include this frequent communication as a necessary part of SLAs. Totally agree with you on this. I've actually seen contracts get reworked to include some of that language. So yeah, in other words, make sure that they have a, I almost think of it as like a hotline, right? That people can call into, and that they're committed to ensuring that. Now, some organizations tend to sort of adapt to this. Site that you can log in, you've got an account or something. That's often a very safe way to do this, but whatever works. And to the point, the more frequent the communication, the better. Another thing that you need to do is monitor, and this is numerous things. Okay, number one, internal behaviors. So, and this one's tough. I mean, this is definitely sometimes easier said than done. But what should SolarWinds be doing, right? I always think of like, hey, this system. Did you happen to notice that Notepad.exe has initiated a network socket outbound? That's odd. What a weird day. No. You have a problem, right? I mean, know your software, know your services to the best that you can, and immediately say, have we seen something weird? Where that's sometimes easier than others is with things like service accounts, because you can go back and look at logs and events and say, hey, was service account X that's used by this vendor doing anything? Was it failing logins to file shares? Or were we seeing other activity around that? That's something you can look for. Any remote access. I mean, this is another thing that's just crushing me today, is the number of these remote management and monitoring solutions that is, unfortunately, just all over the place in our organizations. We're just seeing a ton of this stuff that people are using to come in and hack us. And a lot of times that's used by managed service providers. And then, of course, the externalized side of this is the reputation services, right? So looking at things like reputation and threat intel, have we seen anything out there in the industry? Have other people observed problems that we might not be aware of yet? Great example of this. And again, anytime I mention a company or an organization, please know I'm not throwing stones. I'm just mentioning them because they're public. But a great example of this was Capital One a couple of years ago. And the folks at Cap One are very good. They're very skilled. They know what they're doing, but they had no idea that their data had been leaked. Ultimately the data that was leaked was in fact their client's data, but they weren't the first to know, right? Somebody saw it posted somewhere else. So, it happens more often than not. Now, the final thing here to do is try, again, this is 24 hours. If you have a threat hunting mechanism within your organization, this is going to make life easier for you, because you're going to have tools more than likely that facilitate gathering some of these indicators or potential TTPs, meaning, hey, look, what should I be looking for, especially for things that are internal, or if you've got remote access from a vendor or from a third party. Those are your two big cases here. I would certainly put some watch lists out there on data. So if you have the means to go and perform some, sort of threat intel monitoring on the internet, if you've got sort of that dark web visibility, as it were, then, looking for those data types or that exposure might be something that you should, immediately focus on. But if you've got any inkling whatsoever that things are occurring within your infrastructure, whether cloud or traditional on-premises, you 100% need to start building out that threat intelligence gathering and that internal monitoring that is going to help you determine whether or not something else is going on. Okay. So these are definitely some interesting things to keep in mind. But like I said, to some degree, this is very much going to depend on the nature of the exposure, the nature of the breach itself. So a couple other key tips that I want to impart here before I sort of start wrapping up and hand things off to Scott. Going through some of those phases in the NIST framework, preparation, by the way, we're all in preparation right now, right? Preparation is really any time you're not actively dealing with an incident. Check your threat intel on all of your critical third parties. Try to build up that reputation set to understand, what do they look like today? Good example of this. And I know probably some of you, maybe many of you will resonate here. You do the kind of classic risk questionnaires for, vendors and third parties. How often do you revisit those answers, right? Is it every 6 months? Is it every year? Is it every 3 years? Is it never? That matters. And so, looking to build some more consistent means of evaluating changes and reputational changes in particular with vendors and third parties is absolutely something that will aid you in these circumstances. Again, for detection, provider access. So anything with privileges, you should ideally know about it ahead of time. But some tools can really be helpful here, particularly things like micro-segmentation utilities and so forth. If you've got them, they're hard. Obviously, most of us have sort of the classic network access controls, from VLANs to, ACLs to on and on, firewalls and everything else. But if you have the ability to perform very particular isolation and do so in a relatively pain-free way, then that's going to help you a lot, right? Some basic behavioral monitoring can also go a long way, but you got to understand the appropriate behaviors first, and that's tough. If some of you have hundreds, thousands of different software, packages and vendors and services, just, coming in and saying, well, you guys should really know what normal looks like, it doesn't help, right? That's not helpful. So do your best and try to work with some of the stakeholders and app owners and folks to build some baselines and things early. That's all going to be helpful when you hit that detection stage. Communications, and we've already touched on this just a little bit. Are you breached? Do you need to communicate outbound? If you don't know that you're breached or that your data has been breached, then, you're certainly not going to go out proactively and shout to the world that you've had some sort of data breach or exposure unless there's an impact, right? So if your stakeholders and your employees' inability to get their jobs done is rolling down, or if it's going to ultimately cause like delays in FFIEC filings or something, then yeah, you definitely need to make sure there's some proactive communication that takes place, and you should have that coordinated. You should know who's going to be the responsible person for making that communication update. Ideally, you have it prepped in terms of what you're going to say. You should have a staged approach to what you're going to say. Hey, we're looking into an outage, and we'll know more soon, right? Like we don't really know much yet. But as you learn more, what I always say is build a decision tree, right? Build communication decision trees that are predicated upon what you know and when, and actually have timeframes in those decision trees. It's actually a really cool kind of tabletop exercise to go through with PR teams and HR teams and some of the others. In terms of containment, you need to know how much access the vendors got, what privileges they have, and again, is this an internal breach where you're actually responding, or is it potential PR, meaning, oh my gosh, we've got to go announce to the world that we've had a problem, and whether it's the third party's fault or yours or something of both, there's probably some communications outbound that needs to take place there. So yeah, a couple things to sort of finish with. You should definitely do some risk reviews, decide on the controls that they need to demonstrate compliance with you. One of the things we're seeing is like a software bill of materials starting to become more common there, like an SBOM. Understand how often you need to do security reviews with those vendors. Start with the most critical ones, right? Start with the most prioritized ones. Define that remediation and arbitration process. Anytime these third-party organizations aren't meeting your security requirements, that's a breach waiting to happen. And so if somebody's not meeting best practices that you require, obviously they need to get back in line, or they need to be put on sort of a watch list at the very minimum of this could go downhill soon, and we need to check back in probably sooner than later. Things like gold images from manufacturers, looking for software development, obviously looking for things like secure storage. Can they remediate issues quickly? This is definitely something we're seeing more and more require as well. If they're a software company that has a problem, what's the expected SLA on a workaround, if not a patch, right? Those are definitely things that we're starting to see a lot more discussion around as well. Look at risk rankings, right? So make sure that you're relying on those reputation rankings, those risk rankings. And obviously, you're probably not going to want to do business with anybody that starts off life in that high severity risk category. But if they move into that category based on something, very specific, how long do they have to address it, right? And having services in place that can keep you up to date on this stuff more consistently and on a more frequent cadence is only going to prove useful and valuable to you as well, right? So reviewing those third-party relationships, this is absolutely something that, again, more and more organizations need to do, and they need to do more often. It's just a matter of saying, hey, look, is it possible, right? Is it possible for me to do it? Do we have enough time? Do we have enough manpower? How do we conduct those third-party reviews? How often do we revisit those? What's the recourse if we have a vendor product or service that leads to a breach? Is law enforcement necessarily going to be involved? Are regulators necessarily going to be involved? Our contract terms stipulate and specify here as far as SLAs and communications, as we've discussed. This is all the upfront stuff that ultimately needs to take place when you're trying to get ahead of these breaches, right? Not necessarily those sort of core things to do right after one, but ideally ahead of that, right? So, just looking at the conclusion here, it looks like I've got two specific questions I'll quickly answer. One is, how will AI enhance and make business more vulnerable to cyber attacks? How should businesses plan for a complex landscape of AI usage in this case? Well, that's a big question, probably a little bigger than I can answer, like fully in this time that we have left. But I'd say, number one, if AI is being used as a critical element of the third party that you're relying on, they're potentially subject to things like data pollution attacks. And you're going to want to ask them as part of your analysis what they're doing to protect the data sets and ensure that they don't have any sort of manipulation with regards to, say, machine learning algorithms, and that the data that's being stored needs to be carefully protected. And same thing goes for you if it's your side, right? So those are really big things, but that's a huge topic, and I wish we had more time to explore it, but good question. And then the last question I've got here as we wrap up, and I hand it off to Scott, do I think that there will come a time when all third and fourth parties will be required to have cyber insurance to cover expenses, since there's no escaping like breaches and the use of this kind of stuff? I feel like that's probably a fairly safe assumption, to be completely honest with you. I don't think the insurance industry is there yet, to be completely open here. I think the insurance industry, look, if you want to talk about an industry that's cautious, it's the insurance industry. They're insurers, right? So they take a long time to really build out those models and feel like they have a handle on what's adequate within those contractual, kinds of tiers for insurance. But I mean, you've got an entire, like huge industry that's still figuring that one out. So I don't think that model of things is going to happen overnight. It is definitely shaping up, but it is not. I wouldn't expect this to be, sort of a rubber stamp within the next year, maybe even 2 years, but wouldn't surprise me to see that one coming down the pipe. Right. So another great question. So, okay. Again, great discussion here. Definitely appreciate everybody. And if you've got any other questions, obviously, as I hand things over to Scott, please send them in and we'll do what we can to get to these here at the end. So I'm going to stop sharing here, Scott, and hand it over to you, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you, sir. All right, everybody, real quick here, make sure you guys can see my screen okay. Quick check. Melissa, can you see my screen?
I sure can.
Awesome. All right, everybody, just a couple of quick notes here as we kind of wind up our time today. I want to leave time for additional questions at the end of the webinar as well. So use this as an opportunity to kind of think of what you want to ask Dave next. I want to touch on some third-party incident response strategies that probably can help you address if that tends to be a struggle for your organization. Our approach to managing third-party risk is to look at risks holistically through the relationship lifecycle. From the point where you're evaluating a vendor or conducting due diligence in order to make a sourcing or selection decision to onboard a vendor, supplier, third party, all the way through the point where that relationship ends and you want to terminate it, offboard them, whatever. There are distinct risks that are present at every one of those stages of that life cycle, from not having the right insight into the cyber posture of a potential vendor, to not having good contractual language or enforceable contract language built in to the contract, not having good visibility into the inherent risk that a potential vendor brings to the organization, not offering or being able to reinforce good remediation guidance, not having good visibility into the types of risks that are presented to your organization via that third party in between your annual or periodic third party internal controls assessments to measuring SLAs and more. Third party risk is so much more holistic than an onboarding exercise or simply responding when a third-party incident, occurs. It's so much more holistic, requires so much more discipline and strategy. And that's kind of where we specialize, is helping you implement that end-to-end strategy for third-party risk. And oh, by the way, incident response is a key piece of that. What we do is we deliver a solution that is really a three-part harmony. First is it's backed by experts in our field, people with years of experience who have pretty much seen it all, done it all in terms of third-party risk, seeing security, operational, financial, reputational types of risks and how they impact the organization. And we can manage that third-party relationship that I mentioned on the previous slide on your behalf if you choose to outsource it to us for managed services. Second piece of our solution is the data element. We incorporate what ends up being 250,000 or so separate data sources into the platform that help to inform risk scores and give you the insight that you need to validate your internal controls assessments and then make some decisions on what you want to do about a particular risk. And then third, all of that is housed in the platform that is your source, your foundation for reporting, workflow, management, and more. So, it's holistic, comprehensive, solution to help to address, your third-party vendor supply chain, requirements. Very specific to today's conversation, though, is how you get faster and more programmatic in how you find and fix, the results of a third-party security incident. We heard Dave talk about several specific incidents recently. MOVEit is one that just keeps on giving. We see announcements about the MOVEit breach almost on a daily basis. Organizations that have continually been impacted by it. Of course, SolarWinds is the same type of long-lasting impact. And we find that organizations struggle with 5 different issues when it comes to adding that programmatized approach or more discipline and rigor to their incident response process with regard to third parties. First is not really having visibility into all of your vendors and your extended vendor ecosystem. This can come down to a lot of different factors. Maybe, different vendors are being managed by different departments. Maybe you're assessing vendors in different tools or in different ways. And it's not all kind of built in a single inventory. So everybody has visibility, and then you can assess that vendor, accordingly. It tends to be a challenge. And that's based on managing a manual, process for vendor assessment. Second is you're not really having the right questionnaire content in a platform to determine your risk exposure. So it's one thing to do a cybersecurity assessment to get a picture of your vendors or suppliers, public-facing internet infrastructure, potential vulnerabilities, weaknesses that could be exploited, whatever. But nothing beats a good old deep internal controls exercise. And I know it's painful, but it's got to be done. And in the context of a third-party security incident, what we find is a lot of companies, are using a generic assessment or maybe a completely overweight assessment where you just need to know the basics of, are you using the software? Have you taken the appropriate actions that the software vendor or supplier has recommended? Is it impacting operations? Has it touched our data? Things like that, right? Be very prescriptive about it. Third, big challenge that organizations face is tracking, scoring, and managing risks. Okay, you've asked these questions. Now what do I do about it? And how do I track it to conclusion? And that kind of leads into the fourth one, offering prescriptive remediation guidance. Not having the very specific recommendations to recommend back to the vendor in order to address some of those vulnerabilities or weaknesses that are discovered in that process, which then might mitigate the opportunity for the threat actor to kind of break through into your systems. And then finally, reporting on progress and mitigations. Look, the board's going to want to know. And, if something high profile happens, that call is going to come down from the board, from the senior leadership team. Is this going to, could we be exposed? What's our approach to that, whatever. And that lack of reporting tends to be an inhibitor. And that's what we deliver in our third-party incident response solution. Like, I'm not going to read all this finite type to you. You guys will get this presentation tomorrow. But just suffice to say that, what we do is we offer an ability to onboard an unlimited number of vendors into the platform. We give you a very detailed incident response assessment built into the platform, which that can be customized. And then whenever a major incident happens, like MOVEit, like SolarWinds, like 3CX, or one of these others, within 24 hours, we have an SLA to send out a very specific and targeted piece of content into the platform, which then you can then leverage to assess, your third-party vendors. Scoring, put it all in a central risk register, give you automated response actions and remediation guidance, and then ultimately some reporting templates that help you communicate, your risk status against these particular, incidents or security risks throughout the organization in language that, the board, senior leaders, and not just security people can really understand. So that's our approach to kind of addressing, that continued third-party risk management incident response challenge. Look, at the end of the day, it comes down to three things that you really have to answer, and an approach like ours is going to help you achieve these things. And that's number one: do you have the answers when management and the board asks? And that requires you to centralize your vendors in one place, assess them consistently, get a consistent set of answers, and then recommend remediations so that you can proactively report to the board and senior leadership, hey, we got this under control. Second, to shorten critical response time, mean time to resolution, mean time to response. Time is money, and you don't want to be in a situation that some vendors were in a year or two ago. Colonial Pipeline, for example, they had to shut down operations because they couldn't respond fast enough to a ransomware issue. And then third, everybody's favorite, having a solid incident response plan in place to understand what you have to do when an incident occurs, a tested plan, the tabletop exercises as Dave alluded to. It'll help alleviate the burden of the auditors, being on your back about this. It won't remove it altogether, of course, but it will make that load a lot easier to carry. So at any rate, the 5 things you should do after, in the 24 hours after a third-party breach occurs. Dave, great job on that. Just a little bit on prevalent about how we can help simplify that process for you guys. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Melissa to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, as Dave said, put those questions in the Q&A. I know we've already got a few of them kind of going. But I'm going to launch our second poll in the meantime. You will see that pop up. I'm curious if you're looking to augment or establish a TPRM program. I know we're getting towards the end of 2023 already. It's November today. So maybe you're scrambling to get budget solidified. Better late than never, but never late is better, they say. So let me know, is there a project in the works? And be honest, we really do follow up with you. So let's see, Dave, I know we do have a few questions. I'm going to kind of turn it to you to decide which one you want to cherry pick, or two out of the whatever we have time for. So go ahead. Your audio is a little funny. I'm not sure, Scott, can you confirm that, or is that just on me?
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you, Dave.
Dave's gonna have to do some sign language here.
All right, let me try that again.
Yeah.
Is it coming through any better now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Zoom.
It's not working again.
We lost you again, Dave.
I know. Maybe, let's see. Maybe I'll read the question, and then maybe by the time you're ready to answer, it'll work. So I'll start with that first one. I'm not sure if that's even the one you're reading, but it says, I'm in third-party security. Although we have contacts on file in the system to reach out to third parties regarding breach and vulnerability impact, we have a very difficult time receiving responses back from our communications. Any suggestions or best practices appreciated? So maybe
Let's see. Can you hear me okay now?
Yep.
Okay. Maybe I'll just leave my video off. Not that anybody needs to see me anyway. Okay. So assuming you can still hear me now, then I will give an answer to that. So the first, and I would say probably the most important part, is you need to get into the contract.
Not coming through, Dave.
Dave, we're losing you.
It's like you start off strong and then it just dwindles down. Well, I mean, could I turn that question to Scott? Do you have any suggestions there?
Well, so yeah, I think what Dave was getting to is first and foremost contractual enforcement, getting the right to audit clause and getting the right to assess clause and all that stuff built into the contract and getting enforceable. Second, getting people to respond. Do you have the right people? I mean, that's always the question. Whatever, there are services out there that will help you obtain the right contacts, whether it's a Clearbit or a Zoom Info or something like that, to help you find the right operational contacts to reach out to make sure you're getting the right people. And beyond that, we've seen success in like outsourcing, giving that exercise to an outside team who's responding on behalf, who can follow up at a level of aggression that borders on collections that really encourages people to attend with a little bit of carrot and stick involved. So between contractual enforcement and services out there to help do the work on your behalf, that's one piece of it. And then a final piece of it is, we've seen some approaches in the past where you conduct a scan on that vendor and basically send it to them and say, hey, look at your risk rating. You've got some issues here. Are you going to respond to this or not? Or we're not going to be able to do business with you going forward.
Right. Well, I'm not sure if we're going to attempt to have Dave keep talking. Do you want to say something?
I can. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I completely changed my audio, so sorry about that, everybody. Like radical changes all at once. Let me see if I can say hello to everybody again. All right, look at that. Okay, hopefully you can hear me for the duration here. We got a few minutes, but and I'll just throw it. Again, Scott gave a great answer to that, but it's like, look, there's got to be, especially if it's regulated data, got to be a requirement, right? Meaning, hey, look, we may have an obligation here that you let us know particular aspects of this, or we could end up in compliance trouble, in regulatory trouble, or even law enforcement trouble, depending on the circumstances. So that first question is absolutely about, hey, let's get it in there. But all you can do is apply pressure thereafter, right? And basically, here's the thing: if you and any other customers or partners or associated third parties are all experiencing the same thing, and that gets documented, and it comes out in the news that they were stonewalling you, that's a huge reputational risk these days that's going to have a major impact on them some way, shape, or form. So I think that has to be taken into account in one way or another.
Perfect. I think we might even have time for one more question because we can hear you.
Okay, yay.
There's a few, but
I usually have much better luck. I just dialed in here versus using the computer audio, and it's usually much better with computer. But hey,
all good.
Today,
that's life.
Wednesday, yeah, right on. So somebody asked, and I can certainly hit this one really, really fast. The risk ranking slide, how to obtain risk rankings. You're gonna build some of those yourself. I mean, that's typically what many organizations do, based on your personal experiences. But that's something you're gonna have to acquire. I mean, it really is. You're not gonna be able to go just find that randomly scattered around on the internet and hope that it has any degree of currency, because it changes all the time. So I mean, that's probably better to buy it versus build it, but that's the only way you'll keep up, especially at scale.
All right. And you're right. You answered that one very quickly. Maybe hit another one.
I absolutely can. Yep. So the next one here, says, hey, look, smaller third party, they don't have appropriate resilience or governance or cybersecurity framework, all these kinds of things. Would they potentially get insurance if the contract is significantly increased in monetary terms? Or is this a third party a really bad risk that should just be avoided? That is a loaded question. It's a great one, but it's a loaded one because I think it very much depends on, and it sounds so bad to say this, how easily they are replaced, right? I mean, I'll just call it out, and I have nothing against the folks that make MOVEit, but it's a file sharing platform. I don't know if you guys are aware, but there are numerous file sharing platforms available today, some of which may have better software engineering practices. You have to ask yourself those things. So if it's super critical for you and your industry, that's a very tough call to make. But if it's, I'll call it a commodity vendor, service provider, or software, I would very much be looking at the ones that had much better terms with regards to insurance coverage, in terms of cybersecurity best practices and answers and responsiveness contractually as well.
Okie doke. Well,
we can answer Mark's question. I mean, we can absolutely handle Mark's question here. Should there be a formal written disaster and incident response plan? Yes. See, that was easy.
All right. Well, you heard it from Dave, so I mean, it must be true. I have no other questions on my queue as of now, but I did put my email in the chat just in case somebody thinks of something in 20 minutes. But again, thanks, Dave, for coming. Scott, of course, thank you for being here and giving us your spiel. And, thanks everybody for all your questions. And I guess that's pretty much it. I'll see you guys maybe at the next webinar. Take care.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.